Welcome to the Commercial Real Estate Academy podcast, the podcast dedicated to simplifying the commercial real estate industry for the masses. Each week, we sit down with industry experts to dissect the many facets of commercial real estate and extract valuable lessons you can apply to your business. Whether you're a new or seasoned business owner or investor, the Commercial Real Estate Academy podcast will be your go-to resource for all your commercial real estate needs. Now, here are your hosts, Raphael Collazo and Jeff Walston.
Welcome to the Commercial Real Estate Academy podcast. I'm your host, Raphael Collazo, here with my co-host, Jeff Walston. How's it going, my friend?
Going great. Business is moving forward. We are in the first part of spring. I'm excited. 2022 just keeps looking better and better. So what about you, Raphael? How's it going over there?
It's great, man. It's good. Positive attitude all around. I've been reading a new book that's been very insightful. It's called Value Added. It's a book written by a gentleman who is an investment broker, and he's been very successful in his career, and he kind of imparted wisdom to those individuals who are looking to get into the investment brokerage space about things they can do in order to, build out their systems and their business in order to be an effective broker. So, it's been a pretty insightful and impactful book. And, other than that, business is going good and the weather is starting to pick up, which is always nice. So, but speaking of just a great conversation, we had a really, really interesting conversation with Bryan McLaren. He's the CEO of Zone Properties. And the reason why it's very interesting is because we really have not had anyone come on the podcast that have talked about this subject. And it's the cannabis industry, how it pertains to commercial real estate. And Bryan has a background in urban development and urban planning, and then got into the commercial real estate brokerage space through his, properties, Zone Properties. And they offer a variety of different services for those individuals who are looking to establish operations for, the cannabis industry, whether that's the actual growers, the wholesalers, the retailers. So if you have a storefront, et cetera. So they help advise people in different municipalities across the country as to how you can get in and start your operations from a legal standpoint. And the interesting thing about the industry itself is that it's so fragmented and the laws are still evolving as time has progressed. So it really is a unique situation every municipality you go to when you're trying to start these operations within those municipalities. And so during our conversation, we talked about, how he got into the commercial real estate industry in the first place. Like I said before, he had an urban planning background, which kind of impacted his ability to maybe transition into that, but it wasn't necessarily a foregone conclusion that he was going to get in the commercial real estate industry. We also talked about some of the early struggles he faced as he was looking to scale the business and, some of the nuances of the actual process of getting people into those location. We also talked about, obviously the hurdles that people face when they're looking to get into one of those buildings, whether they're growers, wholesalers, retailers, but also talked about if you're a commercial property owner, what are some of the things you need to think about and maybe some of the value that you can provide to your property by moving a retailer or a wholesaler or a grower into your commercial building. And he was talking about some of the premiums that can be achieved from a rent standpoint and even a value standpoint. And it was pretty significant depending on which municipality you're in and how they restrict or limit the licenses that can actually be pulled down for those types of uses. And then finally, at the end, we talked a little bit about how he sees the cannabis industry evolving. Currently, nationally, as many of you know, the cannabis is federally illegal, but there's almost, I think, 37 or 38 states that have legalized it in some form of fashion, whether that's medical uses or full-blown, recreational use for adults. And he foresees, given the changing sentiment of people pertaining to cannabis, that it's going to continue to expand in operations over time, and that at some point in the probably not too distant future, it will become federally legal, and that's going to open the floodgates as far as opportunities for commercial real estate providers to service individuals who are looking to invest in these types of properties. And then if you're an operator, how can you actually get in there and utilize the space for your intended use? So again, I found it extremely insightful. It's definitely a topic we have not covered during our conversations with people across the nation. Jeff, do you have any insights you'd like to add?
Yeah, I know that people are going to gain value from this episode for sure. Me being the commercial GC as I am, people actually come to me and are actually building up to this, especially around in Kentucky, and they see how the wave of the cannabis industry is coming. So they want to be prepared. So they have a lot of questions, and I know this will help for sure. And I also want to add, I want to say that I really, really appreciate it. We both do, for all the 5-star reviews that you guys are giving us, and the likes and the shares. We really appreciate it. Keep giving them, guys. We can't say that enough. It really does help with the algorithm for all the Spotify and Apple Podcasts and all that. So just please keep giving them, and we really appreciate it. So
no, I couldn't agree more. And it really does make a difference. And we've seen a significant uptick in the downloads as a result of you guys doing so. So please continue to do so. But really, we want to go ahead and make sure that you guys get a lot of value from this podcast episode. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right into the podcast. Well, hey, Bryan, great to see you this fine afternoon.
Yeah, thank you so much, Raphael, for having us.
Oh, for sure, man. No, and for those of you guys who are tuning in to the podcast, they're actually tuning in from Arizona, which were my old stomping grounds. I went to high school in Southern Arizona, then went to Arizona State, so very familiar with the area, and it's just amazing the growth that's been experiencing since I left in 2014. I mean, it's unbelievable. It's almost unrecognizable when I go back.
It's wild. And from a real estate perspective, I mean, it's something like 20 commercial planes full of people are arriving here every day. I mean, it's fastest growing county in the nation. And it really, when you get out and start driving around, it feels like millions of people are coming here. So it's exciting.
Yeah. I mean, so when I went to Arizona State, I was in the North Campus at PV Maine. They knocked down all those buildings, and now it's all brand new, nice buildings. I mean, the old fraternity houses were right behind that as well. They knocked all those down, built up some new buildings. So that's just around ASU. And obviously, you, as you mentioned, some of the fastest growing counties in the country are located in Phoenix. So, obviously it's a very exciting market to be in, and I'm sure you're taking advantage of it as best as you can. So.
Yeah, that's right. And I like to joke with folks at ASU. They think they're a university. They're really a real estate company. They're like just developing billions of dollars of real estate every year. It's wild. It's great.
Oh, it is. And it's great for the area too. But first off, we're honored to have you. And this is going to be a really interesting podcast because it's a topic we really haven't talked a lot about. And the cannabis industry has really been coming to the forefront really over the last decade as regulations in states across the country have started loosening up, and these opportunities have been coming to the marketplace from a commercial real estate standpoint. But really, to start off, what we like to do is to learn a little bit about the person that's across the table from us. So if you don't mind giving us a little bit of backstory about you, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, wonderful. And for your audience, we'll do our best to really give an overview. Cannabis might be brand new for some people. It was certainly very new for me 10, 15 years ago when I started getting involved. And we'll cover everything from kind of where we are generally, and then dive into some interesting complex details when it comes to commercial real estate too. And I love talking about this stuff. So it's really, you get to turn on that kind of nerdy real estate, urban planning side that we all love here in this community, listening, which is great. So yeah, really appreciate being here, speaking with you. I was looking at the podcast and a bunch of the content you guys have covered, and just such a cool idea, like the academy for anyone that's getting involved in commercial real estate. It's a tough industry. If you're especially not a second or third generation, real estate family, that's entering the space, it's a lot to learn. So really appreciate resources like the podcast here you guys are running. So background for me, I actually come from the sustainable development world. So I spent many years starting in my undergraduate education out in San Diego, and then almost a decade of graduate academic research and work exploring how to develop and plan communities that would be sustainable, how to develop the built environment, how to build codes and regulations that benefit the most number of people in a certain community, everything from a small little town to a giant, metropolis, like we were just talking about with Phoenix and Tempe here in Arizona. And so while I was doing that research and really hands-on kind of academic internships and approaches, working with city governments and planning offices, getting into that detail about, how does this system work? We all live in it. And for most of us, even if we're real estate professionals, we may never see kind of the back of house, how the actual system is built and operated. And I was one of those kids who was obsessed with SimCity. Like, I always loved playing those strategy games and, how do you set up the different communities and roadways and infrastructure. So that led me into working specifically on parts of sustainable development that interact with the built world and with buildings, like LEED development, sustainable building system ratings, and also renewable energy installations. So when you're in a community that wants to put up the first wind turbine they've ever had, sometimes the local planning and zoning code isn't in existence to do that. And that's where I started to really learn that in new emerging industries and regulated and complex industries, just how impactful the local zoning and planning codes can be. And so about a decade ago, I had the opportunity to look at some of the initial regulated cannabis projects as Arizona was getting legalized and starting back in 2010 and then 2012. And just saw such a cool opportunity to take everything I was doing for green buildings and renewable energy and for regulated cannabis, as we're going to get into today. It really all comes down to how these localities, there's about 40,000 of them in this country, in the US here, how they will regulate and permit real estate to be developed for this industry. And so that's how I got into it. That's where I came from. And there's a huge opportunity in regulated cannabis, which is forecasted to be 100-200 billion industry of economic impact in the US. Sustainable development strategies and approaches, this is the opportunity to get it done right from the very beginning.
For sure.
So yeah, that's where I'm coming from here.
Oh, for sure. And like you said, it's a growing industry because I think a lot of states around the country are realizing that the tax implications of it. I mean, it's already being, consumed by the general populace. And if there's an opportunity to create a tax base for it, it could be a great opportunity for them to be able to fund other things within the state that is of benefit to the general populace as well. And, as far as the urban planning background is concerned, it's kind of interesting to hear you say that. One of my good buddies in college, Lucas Lindsay, he was he studied urban planning, and he was always fascinated about the ways you could structure a city so you can really extract the most value for the general population. I read this book called Walkable City that kind of talked about the impact of the ability to walk around the city and all the different tactics that this gentleman utilized in different municipalities around the country in order to make cities more friendly as far as those things are concerned. So that's awesome to hear that background. As far as the commercial real estate angle, so you were doing these sustainability projects, from a municipality standpoint, and then the opportunity presented itself to be able to get into the regulated cannabis industry. Can you kind of talk about that transition and why exactly development of commercial real estate? Why did you decide that was what you wanted to do?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe I'll back into that and start with a little bit of a market landscape for the audience, which I think will be really helpful of kind of where the opportunity was for me personally and professionally to transition into the commercial real estate for cannabis space. So especially for anyone who might be really new and going, what is this regulated cannabis thing we're talking about? What we're talking about is really a transition of a brand new industry. And I say brand new a little tongue in cheek, but it's a transition because the industry already exists. So we like to call the history of the cannabis space, for those of us that are in the industry now, the legacy market. So this is essentially cannabis operators, whether they're cultivators of marijuana and cannabis plants, or whether there's processors, so extracting oils out of the plant, infusing them into things like edibles or tinctures or drinks, and then operating to sell those products through a wholesale or retail environment. This has been around for decades. It's just been illegal. And so what makes the regulated cannabis space so interesting is you're really taking this humongous population of cannabis professionals from the underground market that used to be illegal and transitioning them, so those are the legacy operators, into now the legalized regulated marketplace. But we still have a very interesting conflict of federal law and state by state and local laws. So at this point in time, March of 2022, the federal government in the US still views cannabis, and cannabis being kind of at the top of the tree of this plant from which you get different cannabinoids and various elements such as THC, which is the primary category, is kind of the euphoric side of the effects of marijuana. But then you also have hemp, for example, within the cannabis plant family that is really far more focused on those cannabinoids that don't cause a euphoric or a high. So there's a lot of different parts of this plant and the industries that will come out of this plant and have also for 100 years, and kind of as the transition of the war on drugs and the propaganda of anti-cannabis is now again changing and legalizing. So we still have a circumstance where cannabis is illegal at the federal level, though recent polling shows that a mass majority of American citizens and voters favor the legalization. Something like high 80% of Americans favor medical legalization, and mid to high 60% or even higher now favor the full-on legalization of adult use and recreational marijuana and cannabis. So the reason that's really important to understand is it sets the culture and the stage for what we're about to get to, which is the commercial real estate side. And I'll tie this together with the planning and zoning in a moment. So because of that federal lack of reform, what has had to happen is a grassroots approach to cannabis legalization, which really intersects with sustainability. It's very much a grassroots kind of push by the people to get renewable energy, electric cars, all that stuff going. Same with cannabis. So in the majority of state by state legalization systems, that's how this industry has emerged over the past decade to 15 years, is the voters said, hey, we want to legalize cannabis in our state. It started with California and Arizona actually in the 90s, and then Colorado, Oregon, Washington, really in kind of the 2008 and beyond era, started to introduce these state by state, full legalized, regulated, and licensed cannabis industries. And now fast forward today, 2022, we've got 37, now 38 states plus District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, Guam, districts and sovereign territories that have legalized. So as these states have legalized, then this trickle down governance effect happens where, say, the state of Arizona legalized in 2010, it was going to create and distribute these licenses for operators to acquire. And they kind of just all of a sudden have an industry that needs to be regulated at the local level. It's getting way better now, a decade later, but in the early first few states, local cities, towns, counties, and their planning departments were kind of going, okay, this federally illegal industry is now legal, and we have to figure out a way to work this into the master plan for our community. And so that's where the commercial real estate plugs in. There's about 40,000 independent localities that govern, their own systems of zoning and planning codes. They're all different, which was what makes cannabis so challenging. So the opportunity here with commercial real estate is you got a massive new industry emerging. It's emerging in a complex, non-standard fashion, state by state, city by city, sometimes block by block. And there are, to our best guess, going to be probably somewhere between 50 and $100 billion worth of commercial real estate capital needed to get this industry going. So there's two huge sides of opportunity here for everyone in commercial real estate. There's the capital investment side, and then there's the professional services side. And so at Zoned Properties, what we really specialize in is the services side. We do have capital investments, we own properties, we're growing our own portfolio, but our real kind of core competency and value we bring to the industry is advising and consulting, bringing any cannabis operators or real estate owners through the process of getting their property or their business off the ground as it relates to real estate.
That's awesome. And do you guys usually typically come in on the ground floor, or is it something that, let's say I own a retail building that I think could be, a good candidate for, some form of dispensary, or maybe I own an industrial property that I think could be a good grow operation, obviously with a little bit of investment, because I'm sure the requirements to be able to operate a grower is going to require, lights and whatever other equipment's going to be required to be able to get that thing operational. So is that where you come into play and kind of advise about what the startup costs are going to look like? What are some of the hurdles they're going to face from a local level? Because like you said, what's going to happen in Arizona is going to be different than Kentucky, then it's going to be different than Seattle, et cetera. Is that correct?
Exactly. All the above. So we like to think of ourselves as kind of bolt-on brain trust for our clients. And we have three main kind of prongs of our business. First, we advise and consult. So we come in as that expert in the space that's been through it ourselves. We've been at this for almost a decade. We know the roadmap and the process and many of the unforeseen challenges that lie ahead. We also have a fully licensed commercial brokerage. So we handle buy, sell, lease transactions for clients directly. And then we have kind of an investment and strategy arm. And we can get into some of that later, but one thing I'm really fascinated in right now is property technology. And that's a huge part of where we see the future in the cannabis real estate services space. So we can definitely come back to that. But yeah, it's in those kind of approaches we take to the process of designing, developing, and delivering commercial real estate. We typically will represent two buckets of clients, either a prospective or existing cannabis operator. So someone who's looking at applying for a state license, and then they need to find the property, get it permitted, get it designed. So again, we act as kind of that brain trust member for everything real estate related. We'll introduce them to land use attorneys. We'll help kind of interact with the local planning officials. That's our bread and butter. It's my passion is how do you actually go into the local office and collaborate with them rather than kind of bring the lawyers in and elbow your way in and force your way. That's, always a challenge. And then on the other hand, it's people that have nothing to do with cannabis, but own a bunch of real estate. So they may be a real estate investor that sees the cannabis industry. I'd imagine a big part of the audience falls into one of these two buckets, right? They're either kind of an operator, real estate professional, or they're a real estate investor or property owner. And maybe your property sits in what we call a green zone. So a parcel of land that happens to fit the zoning and permitting requirements. And all of a sudden, you're sitting on a property that could be very valuable. So we represent and advise property owners or property investors that want their real estate portfolio to include cannabis as either a landlord or a commercial lender. And if I might back up, I kind of brushed over something really quickly there that's vital for understanding cannabis and commercial real estate. Not only is this industry non-standard, it's different everywhere. Because it's still federally illegal, the traditional real estate process does not exist yet. So what I mean by that is real estate professionals, many of which have still not entered or interacted with the space. So whether that's commercial brokerage firms or title and escrow, insurance carriers and underwriters and brokers, everything we think of as commercial real estate experts that you need in your formula to have a successful outcome, it might not exist yet where you are. So that's really our company. The whole model at Zoned Properties was built because we originally raised a bunch of money, bought properties, very early adopters in the industry here in Arizona, and we couldn't find a commercial broker. So we had to become one. We couldn't find an insurance company that would provide property and construction insurance and bonding for a cannabis project. So we had to reach out nationally and create relationships with ones that were willing to do that. So just for the entire audience, know that going in, we're living the emergence of the industry. It's evolving as we speak, and it was 6 months ago was very different than it is today, and will be 6 months from now. So the good news is 6 to 12 months ago, it was very difficult to find traditional commercial real estate professionals to work on a cannabis project. That is changing very rapidly. So still big challenges that exist until we see federal legalization and reform. But now more and more brokerages are allowing their realtors and broker reps to work on cannabis projects. There's a lot less fear than there was a year ago, 5 years ago. So that's the opportunity is here to still be a bit of an early adopter, but making sure you understand the risks along the way that could jeopardize your project, whether you're an investor looking to put money into a project, or you're a professional and your income depends on commission and a successful project. You want to make sure, you don't get lost in the labyrinth along the way and jeopardize your successful commission outcome, right?
For sure. No, and I think it's super important when you mentioned about the other prongs of the transaction, the commercial insurance agents, the banks, because a lot of banks, I'm sure, don't even touch it. But in reality, even if you look at the financials, it could be a phenomenal investment opportunity. But I've represented people, for example, in smoke shops, and there's a lot of banks out there that don't touch smoke shops, and there's a lot of banks out there that don't touch particular uses. And I'd imagine cannabis falls in line with one of those, items that not all banks really are interested in. And so leveraging your relationships that you've already developed over time, having gone through the process yourself, because you had to invest, you've invested in these properties from an early stage in the process, I think is of extreme value to people that are interested in getting in the industry. So definitely, tidbits to take away from that conversation.
Yeah, knowing which questions to ask is the big one. If you're getting involved, again, as a vendor, a professional, an investor, an operator, if insurance is going to void any claims because they didn't know it was cannabis, you want to know that going in before you pay your premium. And banking, Raphael, you hit on probably the most important one I kind of glanced over also so far. Because we don't have federal reform, it's still very, very difficult to raise anything close to traditional capital to fund real estate projects. So we kind of see ourselves certainly on the real estate services side of the equation. We know how to go through the process. We know what the important components are. Again, whether it's advising, brokerage, or helping with investments. But the other side of the fork in the road, the capital banking side, really what has occurred because we don't have traditional real estate lending yet, and to be very specific, because of FDIC requirements and lack of federal and congressional banking authorizations, you can't go to your national, let alone regional or even state banks and say, hey, I want to borrow $2 million and do a deed of trust and a commercial lien. There's banks starting to enter the space, but if you get lucky enough to find one in cannabis, the interest rate is probably 12, 14, 20% on that money. So what happened is a few years ago, I believe 2016 was really when it got started, we saw the first REITs, the first real estate investment trusts that were focused on cannabis. And there's about a dozen of them now that are publicly traded that touch cannabis, 5 or 6 that are their sole purpose is capital for the cannabis industry through their REIT. And without those REITs, we would be nowhere near the expansion of the cannabis industry. There's been probably about 30 billion, I would say, put out kind of generally speaking on commercial real estate for cannabis in the country. And about 15 of that, probably half, has come from these REITs. Now, when the federal reform changes, which could be later this year, it could be 10 years from now, that equation will definitely shift. But it's typically the 2 biggest challenges in any cannabis real estate project is the capital and the regulatory authorizations. So licensing, permitting, those are the 2 things that typically will kind of kill a project before it gets started.
Definitely.
And for those of us in the commercial real estate space, if you've ever interacted on the development side, that shouldn't surprise you. Those are typically the two biggest hurdles. So.
100%. Yeah. Now getting lenders on board. And then if there's any rezoning involved, of course, going through that process. And if it's a contentious rezoning, which most of the time I'm imagining cannabis is going to be a relatively contentious one, there's going to be issues that arise as well. So one thing I wanted to gather from you, and you mentioned the two people that you typically serve, like your avatars. Really what they are is those individuals who want to start, with either a grow operation, a wholesale distribution operation, or maybe they're retailers that have relationships with, growers as well. Can you kind of talk about the process of how you guys help them get started? And then number two, we can talk to the second avatar, which is the, property owner. Let's say I own a 3,000 square foot retail building that's located in it's high traffic counts, great visibility area that could be perfect for some form of, dispensary. What do those processes look like, and how do you guys help them get to the finish line?
Yeah, great question. So the first group being the operators, it's all about information sharing, learning, and setting expectations. Especially when we work with legacy operators, and we have a really strong focus on the social equity side of this industry. So we serve all levels of clients, from large, 100 million plus investors to national cannabis companies, referred to typically as MSOs, multi-state operators, all the way down to your mom and pop, one location, or, maybe they're a third generation cannabis cultivator from California, and they want to transition to the fully legal regulated market. So that's important to understand, because the expectations, especially as it relates to timeline, are really big. As we all know, going through regulated marketplaces and red tape and bureaucracy, it takes time. And especially in a high risk emerging market that's very volatile on the regulatory side, it's evolving quickly. Someone who has been dealing in cash and not submitting permits when they, maybe build a little greenhouse on their property, that happens a lot quicker than when you have to submit paperwork, get approvals, go back and forth. So that's the biggest approach, is building an action plan, setting expectations, and really understanding the scope of the project goals and objectives. What do those operators want to accomplish in 1 year, 5 years, 10 years? Are they looking to set something up and kind of search for an exit to sell their operation to a larger operator? There's a huge amount of consolidation and M&A activity in the cannabis industry, where it is in its evolution right now. Or are they trying to set up something to, work for the rest of their lives, create their retirement, pass on to their kids? Those are very different project scopes that, when it comes to the real estate, requires different approaches. That also helps us set the stage and kind of set the table for who else we need to introduce to a client or bring into the project. If it's a contentious zoning circumstance where they are and they don't want to go anywhere else, you need a really good land use attorney. Everything we talked about kind of rattled off from the list so far: insurance, contractors, architectural. These are all things, when you go through a full permitted code process, some people might not be used to. They might, draw something up on a whiteboard and, go to Lowe's or Home Depot and bootstrap it, and it works amazing. Quite a bit different than doing full architectural and mechanical, electrical, plumbing, structural designs that meet code. So in that first realm, that's what it's all about. What's the project team look like? What are the project objectives? On the other side of the aisle, when it comes to a real estate investor or a property owner, really the best circumstance we've seen in the industry up to this point is an absolute passive position. So if you're an owner of a piece of property, industrial, retail, commercial, you think it might, be in that green zone, there's some really good premiums you can get as a landlord for leasing that property in such a capacity that has those real estate rights or entitlements. On average, we typically see 30 to 40% premium. So whether you want to sell your property with some real estate entitlements attached to an owner operator, or a new landlord that's a cannabis fund, or you want to set up a 20-year triple net, absolute passive structure of lease. In those scenarios, it's all about finding out what rights the piece of real estate has. So what are those entitlements? What kind of permits can you proactively get ahead of time? And this is where we start to really work on the brokerage side. We help our clients as property owners set the circumstance up, again, for sale or for lease. And on a landlord leasing scenario with a cannabis tenancy, the win-win here is that most cannabis operators want full control of their property. They typically would prefer to own it, but they likely are going to have challenge raising the capital that will be tied up in the property. So an absolute net, triple net type of circumstance on a lease works great because the landlord's basically financing them. They just get to hold on to title to the property. So, and in some cases, depending on what stage that state or local market is in, what supply and demand ratio of properties might exist in those green zones, the premiums can be even higher than that. So we've seen 100% premiums as highest and best use for cannabis tenancy. You just have to really weigh out what your goal is as a property investor or owner. What kind of risk are you bringing on? Is it a single tenant where that cannabis operator is leasing the whole site? Do you have a multi-tenant circumstance where you maybe put a retail dispensary in? And then that comes back to the other parts of traditional real estate that don't apply yet. That could jeopardize your debt servicing. That could jeopardize your insurance policy. Really interesting kind of through the pandemic. We set up the first ever cannabis focused panel as part of the MBA, as part of the Mortgage Brokers Association. And it was fascinating to talk real time with one of the panel members we brought on. Was a loan servicer for a large, probably $1 billion plus by the sound of it, commercial portfolio that had a couple of cannabis tenants. And so they were trying to figure out, how do we service this? So if you're a property manager or you're, servicing a portfolio for larger clients, even if they're not paying their rent in cash, which is another challenge, cannabis companies don't always have bank accounts, making sure that you are transparent and covered by receiving that rental income. So lots of sides of the equation. And the bottom line is, make sure you've got a team of experienced people that have been through it before. And for anyone in the audience that's interested in general, we're always happy to have conversations with other professionals. Anyone that works in local planning, we have conversations all the time, formal, informal. Our goal here is really to help shift the paradigm, educate the national community when it comes to legalized and regulated cannabis.
For sure. And that's some great advice on the owner front, because I would imagine, vetting tenants it comes into play pretty significantly as you're analyzing these opportunities. And again, I'm sure you probably give credence to, more established cannabis companies versus, the mom and pops, at least starting out. So have you noticed that being a challenge for people who are, getting started, just even if the landlord does have a piece of property, them getting comfortable with the idea of having someone that's maybe not as established as, the larger operators in the space? Yeah.
A big question for all real estate investors, landlord property owners, what is that diligence and underwriting process? One of the reasons we created our advisory and consulting platform years ago is that it allowed us to get better connected with operators in the industry, so that when we represented through our brokerage, when we represented property sellers or landlords, we were able to make introductions that were kind of pre-vetted. But it really depends, Raphael, on the state, on the locality. So some state markets, and again, every single state is its own case study. I mean, it's kind of a neat states' rights issue that 50 years from now we'll probably look back on and assess how it went, of course, but because every state is different, some states legalize through voter ballot initiatives, some legalize through state legislation initiatives. And so you have this varied landscape of the cannabis markets. And one of the biggest differentiating factors state to state is how many licenses will allow cannabis companies to operate legally in the state. So a cannabis license, and what's included in that. So limited license states like Arizona, there's only going to be 169 licenses in the state of Arizona, with a new round of social equity licenses that are coming up. And they're vertically integrated. So if you get one of those licenses, you can grow, you can manufacture, you can set up your own retail dispensary, and you can wholesale between each other. But those licenses go for 20 million plus. So very expensive because there's limited supply, which then significantly impacts the real estate. So even if you can get 100% premium on a lease rate as a highest and best use, if anything happens to that tenant, the new opportunity to replace them with another cannabis tenant, the pool is limited. Whereas if you go to Colorado, California, Pacific Northwest, these open market states, we like to say that these types of states have kind of artificial cap on licenses. So New Jersey and New York, two newly legalized upcoming markets, have no state limit on the number of licenses, but inherently the localities will, either through zoning or number of local permits allowed, there will be this artificial kind of cap created on how many businesses can operate in that market. And so those really understanding the nuance of those regulatory markets state by state will significantly influence the real estate strategy. In a market where there are less than 100 retail dispensary licenses available, you probably want to think very seriously about how much tenant improvement allowance you invest in your own property for a tenant that potentially could fail and then you can't replace, versus a state like if you're in Denver, Colorado, and you have a prime piece of real estate that is great for cannabis retail, you've probably got a lineup of people, waiting for your current tenant to fail so they can go in there. So very different depending on the market, but absolutely we're at this point in the cannabis industry where there's enough momentum and capital entering. You're seeing some significant operators, some brands emerge that are national players. So we're starting to see the creditworthiness kind of variable shift. Whereas 10 years ago, it was kind of, hey, you seem very intelligent and maybe you've shown me some proof that you've done this before, but it's the Wild West and I hope you succeed and can pay your rent. So quite a bit different now than we were 10 years ago.
Yeah, no, and like you said, it's constantly evolving, which is going to be interesting to see how it plays out over the next 5 to 10 years. So that's kind of the question I had for you next was, where do you see the industry evolving over the next 5 to 10 years? And you kind of touched on, the sentiment of the population being pretty much in favor of legalization of marijuana. To be quite honest with you, I'm quite shocked we haven't gotten to that point yet, but who knows if in the next 5 to 10 years, but in your case, where do you see that going? And again, you could talk a little bit from the commercial real estate side. That'd be awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll loop in here something I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation that we'd come back to, which is the property technology side. So an emerging new industry. New industries are coming up all the time, but as we discussed, cannabis is interesting because the industry has always existed. People have been using cannabis products for generations. They've just been acquiring them illegally and consuming them illegally. So we have this built-in history and demand of the legacy market. Some just general broad figures for the audience that impact the real estate needs. And what is that total addressable market? Where's it going 5-10 years from now? We're seeing about 500,000 professionals now employed in the cannabis industry. Best projections put the cannabis industry nationally in the US, so quite a bit different than Germany and Canada and global figures. But for the US, looking at something around a $70 to $75 billion in cannabis sales by 2030. and somewhere between 190 and 250 billion dollars of economic impact. So to put that in perspective, the US alcohol industry is about a $230 billion industry. So you can start to see everything from, liquor licenses on the bar and pub and restaurant side to distribution licenses. Biggest difference in that growth pattern is cannabis is not interstate commerce. So it has to remain within the state at the moment because we don't have federal legalization yet. So if the industry does grow to that level at that pace, which I think those of us in the cannabis industry are paying attention are very confident it will, and those figures might be conservative, we can back into those percentages as a ratio of commercial real estate needs. And if you look at kind of from most recent data that I've seen come out, 2018 is the best commercial real estate data I've seen for what I'm about to talk about. But there's about $15 trillion worth of commercial real estate in the U.S. Somewhere around 4 trillion of that is industrial specialized commercial real estate that would apply to cannabis. And if you back into those economic impact numbers, the kind of 200 billion size industry versus GDP for the country, you kind of get a back of the envelope calculation that there's somewhere between 50 to 75, 80 billion dollars of capital needed for commercial real estate to support the industry. So that's really where we see the industry going from a commercial real estate perspective is we're going to double or triple the real estate for the commercial real estate for cannabis. We have a huge shortage of real estate professionals because it's still federally illegal. So there's a huge need for expertise on every part of the vendor and professional servicing equation. And then there's a huge need for capital because traditional banking and commercial mortgages don't exist yet. So what we're trying to figure out at Zoned Properties is how do you provide that amount of real estate service until the masses all join in? How do you do that nationally? How do you scale that? And so that's where property technology platforms come in. We've spent a couple of years working with a partner that specializes in zoning and permitting data. So kind of SaaS, DaaS, software as a service, data as a service platforms. Really, how do you take the zoning and data requirements from those 40,000 localities and put them on a user-friendly platform to address 75 billion worth of commercial real estate investments? How do you merge those? So we've been building this platform we call Rezone that is a GIS mapping and data platform that our intention is to democratize real estate information. So really put that in the hands of the average person that goes, I want to open up a cannabis dispensary or a cannabis grow site, or I'm a property owner. I want to see if my property is in one of those green zones. That's really the future. Coming back to your specific question, Raphael, is how do you share information? How do you educate the average person that is learning about cannabis or maybe listening to this podcast and never heard about this before? It's really that shift in that paradigm. Cannabis is a good thing for our communities. So when I think about the decades I spent looking at sustainable development, how do we increase prosperity in our local communities? Well, we want things that add jobs and provide economic development, tax dollars for improving schools, infrastructure, parks. We want to increase safety, decrease crime. So the opioid epidemic is a huge one. And initial data we're starting to see out of these case studies is that when you legalize and regulate cannabis, all of the fear-mongering propaganda we heard for the past 100 years since the Nixon era war on drugs began is actually the opposite. So regulated cannabis doesn't decrease property values, it actually increases property values, including residential from initial data gathered, decreases crime, increases safety, increases economic development. So that's the future. I think we have to figure out scalable, efficient and effective ways to communicate this information, have as many of these conversations as we can with like-minded professionals. And that's where the financial opportunity is too. As an investor, as a real estate professional, if there's going to be $200 to $300 billion worth of economic activity from cannabis, that's a lot of potential brokerage commissions. That's a lot of potential consulting fees. That's a lot of rental income from a property portfolio you can grow. That's where we see the industry going, and it's not slowing down anytime soon from what we can tell.
That's amazing. Yeah. And I went to I'm a big tech guy. Actually, I'm an engineering by trade. I was a software developer and consultant for several years. And, I'm big especially into this commercial real estate technology space. That's something that I think we've been a lag on as an industry that really needs to change, not only from the property standpoint, but from the climate impact standpoint as well. And there's a conference called the Commercial Real Estate Tech Conference, the CRE Tech Conference. And I remember I went to the conference in New York City this past year, and there's so much cool technology, especially in the data aggregation, data analytics, and predictive analytics of data. And one of the you were mentioning, being able to know whether or not a site was, zoned a certain way so that it could support whatever the use is. There was a technology there that was kind of interesting, which may be something you want to look into too. There's drone technology where people hover over a site, they map out the site, and then they can access all the, the local data regarding zoning and whatever else. And you can flip through templates. So, if you wanted to, let's say you develop, Marriott has all these different templates based on, if a site's an acre and it's oriented like this, maybe this template's going to fit. So the way they were doing it, they showcased it, they were just flipping through templates, and it was giving them an idea of what a potential cost would be as opposed to pertaining to the template and site, so that developers can make quicker decisions as opposed to having to put a property to contract and then having to go through the whole process that we currently have to go through. And that could waste time, effort, and money. And so it was very interesting to see. And so I love the fact that you're big into prop tech, because that's something that I think is needed in the industry. So
totally. Yeah. I mean, I think if you're going to be a commercial real estate professional sometime, between now and 2040, I was not a tech guy. I had to really learn about it trial by fire, and still learning, drinking from the fire hose. Because if you're going to be in the industry, you got to learn it. You have to. It's coming. I mean, stuff we're seeing brokerages do and not even cannabis related. So a whole separate fascinating conversation. Much smarter commercial real estate professionals than myself will be able to provide information on. But just the demographics of foot traffic is another one that's wild. So certainly when you're having drone technology do surveying and templates on land development, as a broker, to be able to go to a prospective client to go get a listing and be able to bring that and demographic data about, hey, this type of retail category would work best here for these reasons. And that's how I'm going to go market your project and your property and get you the best buyer or tenant. That's a huge competitive edge. And same thing for cannabis. When you're trying to deal with all that complexity already, having those technology and prop tech tools and data is just such a huge advantage.
Yeah, I know. Really, it is game changing, and it's awesome to kind of talk to a like-minded professional about it, because like you said, it is going to be, the way of the future. And if you're not willing to adopt to the new technology coming down the pike, it's going to be tough for you long term. But one thing I wanted to ask you, and this is typically what we do near the end of our podcast, is we like to talk to our guests about what's one of the most impactful books you've ever read. And it doesn't necessarily have to be real estate related or cannabis related, but if you had one to share, we'd love to hear it.
Yeah, I saw this question on your tear sheet, and I pondered it back and forth earlier today. It's such a tough question, right? Because I love reading. It's a huge part of my day every morning. So I think I have maybe two answers for you. One kind of on the personal side, one on the professional side. On the personal side, there is a new, it's kind of mocked as like a children's book, but I think it's a book for adults, like no question. It's a graphic hand-drawn artist out of the UK, Charlie McKessie. And it's The Boy, the Fox, the Horse, and the Mole. Highly recommend it. And it's little simple sayings, but they are so profound. I go through it and read it, and I almost find myself, crying for, how impactful it is, just about how to be a good human being. It's great. So the boy, the fox, the horse, and the mole, that's on the personal side. And then on the professional side, there's a old book I love. I had a leadership professor give it to me, I think maybe my first year in undergrad in San Diego, called The Fred Factor. So, and it's about a postman. And what the book is all about is it kind of follows this postal service guy and just the power of kindness and loyalty and professionalism. And it's just, the Fred Factor. Here's in anything you approach in your professional life, here's how you're going to have a winning formula, and never underestimate the power of kindness. And that's something certainly in the cannabis industry. It is such a wild, complex, complicated, process. Sometimes just being kind, and not just to people you're working with, but to yourself. I mean, I'd imagine a huge kind of some of your audience are entrepreneurs, and all of us in commercial real estate are entrepreneurial in some ways. Man, you got to sometimes just cut yourself a break. It's a tough process to get through developing commercial real estate.
Oh, for sure. And again, I think part of it too is when you exude kindness and gratitude and giving, people respond differently to you. So even if, let's say, you come in an interaction with someone where they are very abrasive and they're not, the nicest to you, if you reciprocate with kindness and understanding and gratitude, that most of the time the conversation shifts immensely. And I can imagine in the cannabis industry in particular, when you're dealing with something that, for lack of a better word, is somewhat contentious. There's certain situations, I'm sure, where you've had to deal with people on the other side that completely disagree with what you're trying to do, and yet coming at them with, understanding, gratitude, and just saying, look, this is why we believe what we do. And we think it's going to be great for the community. I'm sure that's changed people's tune as far as how they interact with you on a day-to-day basis as well. So I think we could all learn to be a little bit more empathetic and gracious with other people. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's, I'd be real curious to put you on the spot here, Raphael. When you ask that question to all the people you have on, any book that comes to mind that just kind of really surprised you or was kind of a whoa, never thought of that?
Well, what's interesting because we try to get people in, obviously, from the commercial real estate industry, but we have people come in from external parts of not just the commercial real estate industry as well, to kind of mix it up as well. And Martha Weidman is a art consultant for commercial real estate developers, and she shared several books pertaining to design and art and how it positively impacts the built environment, essentially. And so that was very interesting. I read one of her recommendations. It was Happy City, similar to Walkable City, but incorporated the design and art, how art and design can really help impact the built environment. And obviously the most common one I would say is probably Think and Grow Rich, and then there's also Robert Kiyosaki's book. I dropped the name right now. I don't know why I'm dropping it, but that's essentially those are probably the two most common. But we've had several very interesting recommendations, and I love this too because I put it on my list of things to read, and I've been taking advantage of people's recommendations. So
love it. Wonderful.
That's awesome. So again, Bryan, we greatly appreciate your time. I've learned a ton about the cannabis industry through our conversation. So again, I'm greatly appreciative, and I'm sure that our audience is as well. One of the things we like to do near the end of our podcast is we like to ask our guests to contribute something to what we call the commercial real estate treasure chest. It's a repository of resources that we make available to our audience. And these are typically helpful PDFs, Excel sheets. We've had people contribute ebooks. So I just wanted to give you an opportunity to ask, what are you willing to contribute today?
Yeah, we have anyone looking to get involved in any capacity, real estate and cannabis, highly recommend you check out our success checklist. It's literally a list of the 11 things we think about when we approach a cannabis real estate project. It's free. You can download it off our website at zonedproperties.com. We'll definitely contribute it to the commercial real estate treasure chest. and it's some of the things are a little bit obvious, but some of the things might catch you by surprise, like we've talked about in this entire session, that just you kind of take for granted when you're doing a commercial real estate project in a traditional kind of sense and industry, and all of a sudden you're in this highly regulated, federal state law conflict industry, and it's like, whoa, I never thought that getting an Alta survey through title specific to cannabis would be a big issue. So this success checklist, highly recommend it, and happy to also follow up with anyone that's got questions on it. You can always reach out directly to us. My direct email is Bryan, BRYAN @zonedproperties.com, or check out kind of our website. Pretty active on Twitter too, just @zonedproperties, constantly tweeting local zoning and permitting discussions and votes and case studies. And just read everything you possibly can if you're looking to get into cannabis. It's changing on a daily basis, it seems now.
That's awesome. And thanks for sharing that. I know I'm going to probably reference it a lot, just for my own knowledge, and I'm sure the audience is going to reference it as well. And then as far as your contact information, that's super helpful. I'm going to go ahead and include that in the description below. So if you guys are watching this on YouTube, feel free to, grab his email, send him an email, and just get in contact with him. Or if you guys are watching this in a podcast format, like a Spotify, Apple Podcast, etc., it'll also be in the description below. So again, Bryan, we greatly appreciate your time. You were awesome as a guest today. If you guys are listening to this in a podcast format, we would greatly appreciate it if you can like, subscribe, and leave us a 5-star review. It's been really helpful with our reach. We've had significant downloads as a result of you guys doing so. So please continue to leave us a 5-star review. If you guys are watching this on YouTube, we would greatly appreciate it if you could like and subscribe as well. It really helps with the YouTube algorithm and ensures more and more people can hear this message. So thanks again for stopping by, and we'll see you all next time.